Hello everybody and welcome to this video where I'm going to analyse the Seamus Heaney poem Follower. Seamus Heaney is my favourite poet ever, so it's an absolute pleasure to talk to you about this poem. So let's begin as always by looking at the poet. And when we analyse a poet, we mustn't just cover any old detail. We must look at details from the poet's life that seem to be important in helping us to understand the poem. So, Seamus Heaney was born in 1939 at Mossbourne Farm, Northern Ireland. He was born into a farming family from generation to generation, although a little bit of a misconception, although his father is ploughing in this poem, his father was actually a cattle dealer. He would buy cattle and sell cattle, but he also did have a farm where he would grow some crops as well. Seamus Heaney's early poetry focused on childhood experience, identity and rural life, and all three of those are found in the poem Follower, which was written in 1963 and published in Heaney's first poetry collection, Death of a Naturalist, in 1966. Heaney spoke in an early TV interview about how a lot of the early poetry of his life dealt with the relationship between verse and other crafts. So thatching became a metaphor for writing poems, divining for water became a metaphor for finding an imaginative source. And in this video, I think it's worth looking at how, yes, there's a father-son relationship explored in the poem, but also there are other, more complex levels of meaning where the poem can be seen as a commentary on writing poetry itself and a love and respect for the past. Now, Heaney was a very successful poet. A BBC report once said that at one point 2/3 of all poetry being sold was Heaney poetry. But despite this, the poet led a relatively simple lifestyle, and Heaney won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1995. So let's just talk a little bit about the context. The main context to help you understand this poem comes in an appreciation of the world that Heaney grew up in. It was a world of physical labour, much of which revolved around farming. Heaney himself said in an interview, "In the family I come from and culture I come from, the idea of doing work that doesn't actually bring the sweat to your brow seems a little paradoxical." But despite this, the poem was written in 1963 when Heaney was working as a lecturer in English at St. Joseph's College of Education. So the poem then is a backwards reflection on a childhood when Heaney felt his life would turn out differently to the reality of what actually occurred. The poem itself focuses on the art of ploughing a field, and this goes to match the theme of the poem in that I might need to explain what actually happens with ploughing a field. So what you're doing is, in Heaney's father's case, you have your plough attached to some horses and you pull the plough through the field and it digs up the soil. And you plough in straight lines to the end of the field and then turn around and go back down the next straight line, leaving a little gap, and this is where you would plant your crops. That's what ploughing is all about. That's an important idea to hold on to for later, is that farmers would plough in straight lines to the end of a field and then turn abruptly around and plough another line. So let's have a look at the poem itself, and once again I'd recommend looking at a video which I'll link in the description where Heaney reads this poem himself. "My father worked with a horse plough. His shoulders globed like a full sail strung. Between the shafts and the furrow, the horse strained at his clicking tongue. An expert, he would set the wing and fit the bright steel pointed sock. The sod rolled over without breaking. At the head rig, with a single pluck of reins, the sweating team turned round and back into the land. His eye narrowed and angled at the ground, mapping the furrow exactly. I stumbled in his hobnailed wake, fell sometimes on the polished sod. Sometimes he rode me on his back, dipping and rising to his plod. I wanted to grow up and plough, to close one eye, stiffen my arm. All I ever did was follow, in his broad shadow round the farm. I was a nuisance, tripping, falling, yapping always. But today it is my father who keeps stumbling behind me and will not go away." So in terms of the literal meaning of the poem, it's pretty easy to understand. Despite a number of specialist terms which are used by Heaney relating to the world of farming, a simple summary would be to say that the speaker, Heaney himself, is saying, "My father was an amazing farmer, ploughing the ground like an expert. I followed after him, clumsy and immature. I wanted to grow up to be just like him, but these days it's my father who follows after me." The only ambiguity, the only sort of mysterious bit in the poem comes at the ending, and there are so many poems in your anthology that do this. They tell a fairly simple narrative story and interrupted at the end with a challenging idea. And Heaney actually explained about this line. So, "It is my father who keeps stumbling behind me and will not go away." I just read a couple of days ago an interview where he said, "I remember being worried about my father reading Follower, what he'd make of it, what I'd made of him. And to this day I don't know how all that went, whether he even read it. Years later he would hear it at poetry readings, but by then it had become more or less processed into a familiar tune." So this is a true story, and Heaney felt quite nervous about how his dad would respond to it. Some of the specialist terms: shafts are poles which connect animals to ploughs. The furrow is the long trench made by the plough that I showed you in the picture. The wing, a part of the framework. The headrig is an area of land at the end of a field which is not ploughed until the very end, because you would take the horse to the end of it and then use that bit of ground, the headrig, to turn the plough around, and then go back down the other way, so you don't plough it until the very end. And hobnailed refers to hobnailed boots. Those are boots which you actually hammer nails into the bottom of them so that they have extra grip as you're walking through the soil. Just a funny note, as I've already pointed out, Heaney's father was a cattle dealer, so he wouldn't have done much ploughing. And in the same interview I just mentioned, Heaney alluded to the banter his friends and family would have with him about this line. "My father worked with a horse plough," they would say. "Well, not a hell of a lot he didn't," was the sort of responses you'd be likely to hear. Always interesting to see how much of a poem is actual literal truth and how much is artistic license, if you like. So, what do we want to think about the theme? In terms of this being a love and relationships poem, this can be easily understood in terms of the way relationships change over time, the changing nature of a parental relationship, a parent-child relationship, and that makes it the perfect comparison for Carol Ann Duffy's Before You Were Mine, and you'll see the analysis of that on my channel here on YouTube, so take a look. Now, when you're writing in the exam, you want to write about language, structure and form. There's nothing particular to write about form here. Some people say this might be using the ballad form. I'm not so sure. But there's plenty to say about structure. And that's why I really want to give you lots of ideas, because most people write about language. So if I can give you some complex but clever ideas about structure, it's going to help you in the exam. So the poem follows a very ordered structure. It has every stanza, every verse has 4 lines. They're almost entirely written in iambic tetrameter, and that's just like Porphyria's Lover, by the way, which is also almost entirely iambic tetrameter. And there's this repetitive A-B rhyme scheme. Remember, iambic tetrameter is a line of 8 syllables with alternate unstressed and stressed. So my father worked with a horse plough. You would stress there, far worked a plough, so you stress and unstress. We might be used to iambic pentameter. Heaney occasionally wrote in iambic pentameter, which is where we have 10 syllable lines. So these are slightly shorter than you might be used to, and that quickens the pace of reading, which could give the poem a sort of breathless quality reflecting the speed and skill the father is able to work at. But the tightly ordered structure reflects the tightly ordered act of ploughing, and there's a level of neatness and perfection which reflects the neatness and perfection achieved by the father. Now, we need to relate that idea to love and relationships, because this isn't a cluster called farming. So how does the tight structure of almost all iambic tetrameter and the A-B rhyme scheme, how does that tight controlled structure link to love and relationships? Well, I would say that the tight order and structure reflects the skill of the father, and therefore what the speaker, what the boy, what the poet so admires and respects in his dad. But there are moments where this tight and neat structure is challenged, and we'll look at that by analysing the rhyme. So this is quite a complex idea, but in the first 3 stanzas where the focus is on the father, the rhyme is what we would call full rhyme: plough, furrow, wing, breaking, round, ground. But in the final 3 stanzas where the focus is on the boy, the rhyme is not quite so neat: wake, back, plough, follow, falling, stumbling. And what we have here is the difference between full rhyme and half rhyme. So let's have a look at what I mean. Well, full rhyme is where the stressed vowels and the following consonants and vowels rhyme, but the consonant sounds before those do not. This is rather confusing, so let me explain with this example of round and ground. The vowel sound in both of these words is the same, the ow. The consonant sound after the vowel is the same, the und. But the consonant before the vowel has a different sound. So this bit, the ow, is the same. This bit, the und, is the same. But before the vowel, the sounds are different because we've got a r and a gr. And that's what we call full rhyme. And we see that mostly in at the beginning when writing about the father's skill. Now, you might read some of these lines and think that isn't full rhyme. And we have to understand Heaney's pronunciation of the words as well to understand the rhyme. When the verses are about the boy, we have more half rhyme. And half rhyme is where the stressed syllable of the end consonants rhyme, but the vowel sounds before them do not. So if we have a look at wake and back, the final consonant sound is the k sound. The k here and the k here. The wake and the back. So there is some rhyme taking place. But the vowel sound before is different. Here the sound is a. So it's wake, a, k. Here it's back, ah is the vowel sound, ah, k. And that's what we call a half rhyme. So it's no good just spotting these things. We have to analyse why they are used. Why all this clever use of full rhyme and half rhyme? Well, the half rhyme always describes the boy, and the half rhyme reflects how he is unable to match the perfection of his dad. He doesn't match up to him. In comparison to his perfect full rhyme father, the clumsy half rhyme boy does not compare. How clever is that idea? I love that idea. I love finding things like that in poetry. That's what makes it all worthwhile. There's also enjambment in the poem. We see a lot of this where sentences do not end at the end of the rhyme but continue into other lines. Don't end at the end of the line, I should say. So if we have a look at the sentence, with a single pluck of reins, the sweating team turned round and back into the land. It is broken here not only by moving onto a separate line, but by a full stanza change. Now, why use enjambment here? Well, the start of a new stanza comes just at the point that the father is turning the horses around to begin ploughing another line. So just as the father has got to the end of the line with the plough, the poet gets to the end of the line, and in fact the end of the verse or the stanza with the poem. Poetry reflecting the art of ploughing is one of the more sophisticated levels of analysis that I'm going to talk about briefly in a second. So the turn between the lines is both literal and metaphorical. And of course, what I love about this, as you listen to Heaney reading the poem, is he doesn't pause here. He says, with a single pluck of reins. There's no pause. And I think he's showing us the speed and the skill his father possesses as he would turn the plough around at the head rig and there would be no pause or stop. The whole poem is about that level of skill, and the enjambment, which is a structure device, is reflecting that. Heaney's use of punctuation also reflects the boy's love for his father. Stanza 2 contains the phrase an expert, finished with a full stop. Now, the full stop causes the reader to do two things. On the one hand, it makes us stop and reflect on what's been said, thinking about the importance of it. His dad is an expert. But on the other hand, it offers a sense of finality. There's no debate to be had here. Heaney's father is indeed an expert. So there's the punctuation reflecting the admiration that the boy has for his dad. I don't think it's all positive, though. The changing nature of the relationship between the boy and the dad is reflected through the changing stanza focus. So the first three stanzas are all focused on my father. It's all about the father. But there's a shift halfway through. And stanza 4 begins with I, the boy, and so does stanza 5, and so does stanza 6. And it's almost like the poet's focus is coming away from his father. He's becoming his own person, developing his own identity, and the focus is coming off the father and onto the boy himself, which reflects the changing nature of the relationship. So let's have a little look at some language analysis. Heaney said when he was writing in The Guardian in 1972 that the poet's skill, quote, lies in the summoning and meshing of the subconscious and semantic energies of words. I love that quotation. It means that poets use language which has multiple meanings, so we can look at alternative interpretations, literal meaning to words, but deeper meaning as well. Let's begin with the title, Follower. Who is the follower? Well, on a literal level, it's young Seamus following his father around the farm as he's ploughing. But he's also following him on a metaphorical level. He idolizes his father. He wants to be like him. He is his follower. And we can take this even further when we look at hobnailed boots. Following in his hobnailed wake, we get the idea that young Seamus is literally following in his father's footsteps, as the old saying goes. But metaphorically doing the same, because early in his life he wanted to plough like his father. We know that he wanted to close one eye and stiffen his arm, just like his dad. But in the final line of the poem, we learn the situation has changed, and it's the father who's now following Seamus. So this changing meaning of the metaphor, the changing meaning of the word follower throughout the poem reflects the changing nature of the parent-child relationship over time. One extended metaphor we find throughout the entire poem is related to imagery of sailing. His shoulders globed like a full sail strung is the obvious introduction to the metaphor. He's talking about when his father's ploughing and the wind billows up through his shirt, and as he's arched over on the plough, it looks like the sail full of wind. But it introduces the metaphor of sailing, which is used throughout. So when we have the sod rolled over without breaking, it's similar to the rolling of a wave, the way a wave will roll over and maybe break or not break. And if you aren't sure of the literal meaning here, the ploughman's job is to cut the earth, to rotate the soil and make the planting of crops easier. And the father is so skilled in this role that he does it without causing any breakage. Heaney's explanation that I stumbled in his hobnailed wake is perhaps the most subtle of all sailing images. The word wake has numerous meanings, but one is the track of waves left in the water by a ship. And the dipping and rising is similar to the passage of a ship across waves, rising and falling. So we found all of these sailing images, and again, it's not enough to just find the images. What are they for? Well, on a simple, literal level, we can see that the skilled ploughing is visibly very similar to the smooth motion of sailing, cutting through soil like a sailing ship cuts through the water. And the metaphor also points out the highly skilled role of the father. Managing a plough with such skill is like mastering a ship. It's a highly skilled job. But another interpretation is that the imagery represents how important the father is. He's both the ship, with the sails clinging to him, and the captain sailing through the soil. He is everything to the boy. And of course, these majestic images stand in stark contrast to those describing the boy, who's always tripping, falling, and stumbling. This video is quite long enough, so let me just finish with a couple of ideas which I'd love you to explore, and put a comment in the comment section if you can further the idea. One way we can look at this poem as being totally different is that it is about the art of writing poetry. The word used for Latin for the turn at the end of the line in the field is versos, and that's the basis for the meaning of the word verse, a turn at the end of the line. And in this way we can suggest that Heaney is carrying on the tradition of working the lines, exchanging the farm equipment for the pen. So could we see the poem as an expression of poetry itself? Can turning the ground be seen as a metaphor for writing a poem? I think this line, to close one eye and stiffen my arm, certainly sounds similar to the art of writing poetry. See if you can find any other evidence for that. We can also interpret the poem as being about the love of a lost way of life. When he was talking about his later life up to the point where Follower was written, Heaney said, "There was always a lot of field work going on. We're talking about the late 50s, very early 60s, when the farmers weren't as mechanised as they'd soon become." So this puts us right at when the poem was written, and in this way it's worth analysing the poem as a representation of the love Heaney has for the lost art of rural life. This still ties in with love and relationships, by the way, doesn't it? Because it's his love of a way of life. It would certainly explain the precise descriptions of the skilled actions and equipment that are used in the art of ploughing. Heaney's love and admiration goes beyond his father. He loves and admires the skillful art of ploughing. He cares for the past. And we see this again in other poems which capture a lost world. Rite of Spring, which describes the thatcher. A Loch Ness sequence which captures the art of the eel fishers. There's a sense that Heaney's poetry is so precise in description because he's mourning the loss of old traditions that were disappearing as he wrote, and as we study them today are perhaps completely gone. We also notice the use of the past tense in "My father worked," which places this event in a historical setting, one that Heaney is looking back on some years later, and the past tense reflects the ancient nature of what is being written about and Heaney's desire to capture it. Well, explore those two thoughts in the comment section if you like. I hope you found this useful. All I ask is that you subscribe to the channel.